The moment everything changes. When control slips away, there is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when a narcissist realizes they are losing control over you. It doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives like a temperature drop in a room you've been sitting in for years. You don't notice it at first. You just feel different, calmer, less reactive, less willing to explain yourself. And that's when everything changes. Here's the part no one warns you about. The moment you start healing is often the moment the relationship becomes most dangerous. Not dangerous in the way movies portray it. No dramatic villain speeches, no obvious turning point. It's far more unsettling than that. Because on the outside, nothing looks wrong. On the inside, however, the narcissist's entire sense of stability has just been threatened. This is the moment they feel it slipping. You didn't yell, you didn't accuse, you didn't give an ultimatum. Maybe you just paused before responding. Maybe you didn't apologize this time. Maybe you calmly said, "That doesn't work for me." And for the first time, you meant it. To a healthy person, that's growth. To a narcissist, that's a crisis. Emily didn't realize it at the time. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that feels too small to matter. A quiet cafe near Central Park, the clink of a spoon against a coffee cup. Daniel was talking, criticizing really about how she'd been distant lately, how she didn't respond fast enough, how it made him feel disrespected. In the past, Emily would have rushed to fix it. She would have explained her schedule, apologized for being busy, reassured him that he mattered. This time, she didn't. She listened, she breathed, and then she said something simple. "I'm not available all the time. I'll respond when I can." Daniel smiled, but something behind his eyes hardened. It was subtle. If you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it completely. That was the moment. Because narcissistic control isn't maintained through force. It's maintained through predictability. As long as they can anticipate your reactions, shape your emotions, and pull the right strings to get a response, they feel safe. Your anxiety becomes their compass. Your guilt becomes their leverage. Your need to be understood becomes their power source. When that stops working, panic sets in. This is why so many people say everything got worse when I got stronger. It's not your imagination. You didn't suddenly become cold, cruel, or selfish. You simply stopped orbiting around someone else's emotional gravity. And here's the most unsettling truth. You don't have to leave for this to happen. You don't have to confront them. You don't even have to say much at all. Sometimes all it takes is silence. A boundary. A calm refusal to engage. That's when the narcissist realizes they are no longer controlling the story. And that realization is unbearable. Narcissists do not experience control as a preference. They experience it as emotional oxygen. Without it, the shame they've spent a lifetime avoiding starts to surface. The fragile identity they've constructed, being admired, being right, being the victim, being special, begins to crack. And when that happens, they don't look inward, they react outward. This is why the most dangerous phase of a narcissistic relationship isn't the beginning. It's not even the obvious abuse. It's the moment you stop playing your assigned role. Because from the narcissist's perspective, you didn't just change. You betrayed an unspoken agreement. The agreement where you manage their emotions, absorb their projections, and doubt yourself just enough to keep them comfortable. When you stop doing that, they feel exposed, and exposure feels like annihilation. So they don't ask what changed in you, they don't reflect on their behavior, they don't grow. Instead, they start reaching for control in more desperate ways. Louder ways, colder ways, more calculated ways. This is the point where people often turn back. Not because they were wrong, but because the pressure becomes intense. The confusion ramps up. The relationship feels unrecognizable. You start asking yourself questions that sound like self-awareness but are actually self-erasure. Am I overreacting? Am I being too harsh? Why does setting a boundary feel like I committed a crime? The truth is, the boundary isn't the problem. The loss of control is. And once you understand that, everything starts to make sense. The guilt you feel, that's conditioning. The chaos that follows your calm, that's resistance. The sudden escalation after your growth, that's fear. This is the moment the narcissist stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a threat. And what they do next is not random. They follow a pattern. A predictable, well-worn pattern that narcissists have used for decades when control begins to slip. 3 tricks, 3 maneuvers, 3 attempts to pull you back into a dynamic that only works when you abandon yourself. If you've ever wondered why things felt fine until you got stronger, why peace seemed to provoke punishment, why your clarity triggered chaos, this is where the answers begin. And if you're listening to this and thinking, this feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me. Because understanding what comes next may be the very thing that keeps you from being pulled back in. Before we go any further, if this conversation already resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's one simple way to support the work here and help us continue creating honest, grounded content about narcissism, healing, and emotional freedom. Your support truly matters, and it helps these conversations reach the people who need them most. Now, let me ask you a quick question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Question: when you started changing in the relationship, what happened first? A. They became more intense, critical, or emotionally volatile. B. They became distant, cold, or suddenly too busy. Comment A or B below. Your answer matters more than you think, and it tells us exactly which trick you were hit with first. Why control is oxygen to a narcissist. To understand why a narcissist reacts so intensely when control slips away, you have to look beneath the behavior and into the emotional machinery that drives it. What you see on the surface, criticism, charm, withdrawal, rage, is not the engine. It's the exhaust. The engine is something far more fragile, far more desperate, and far more hidden. Control is not a luxury for a narcissist. It is not about winning arguments, being dominant, or getting their way in the everyday sense. Control is how they survive their own inner world. Daniel didn't need Emily to obey him in obvious ways. He didn't need her to agree with him all the time or follow explicit rules. What he needed, though he would never have been able to articulate it, was for her to remain emotionally predictable. As long as he could anticipate her responses, as long as he could press certain emotional buttons and reliably get guilt, reassurance, fear, or explanation in return, his internal world stayed quiet. That quiet matters more than anything. At the core of narcissism is not confidence. It is not self-love. It is not strength. It is an unintegrated sense of shame that was never processed, never soothed, and never safely reflected back by others early in life. This kind of shame doesn't feel like I made a mistake. It feels like, if people see who I really am, I will be rejected, humiliated, or erased. That belief becomes unbearable. So the narcissist builds an identity around it, an image, a role, a persona. Maybe it's the image of the misunderstood genius, the self-sacrificing partner, the victim who is always wronged, the charismatic leader, the good guy who just wants peace. Whatever the role, it has one job: keep shame out of awareness. Control is how that job gets done. When Emily used to rush to explain herself, Daniel didn't feel powerful in the dramatic sense. He felt regulated. Her emotional labor kept his inner chaos at bay. Her self-doubt reassured him that he wasn't the problem. Her willingness to adjust herself allowed him to avoid adjusting at all. That's why control doesn't always look cruel at first. Sometimes it looks like closeness. Sometimes it looks like intensity. Sometimes it looks like we're just really connected. But underneath that connection is an unspoken arrangement. You manage my emotions and I won't have to face myself. Healthy relationships don't require this. Two emotionally mature people can tolerate discomfort. They can sit with shame long enough to learn from it. They can hear feedback without collapsing or attacking. But narcissists never develop that capacity. Their emotional system is built around avoidance, not integration. So instead of processing emotions internally, they externalize them. If they feel inadequate, someone else must be wrong. If they feel abandoned, someone else must be punished. If they feel exposed, someone else must be controlled. This is why accountability feels so threatening to a narcissist. It's not because they don't understand it intellectually. Many narcissists are intelligent, articulate, even insightful when it comes to other people. The problem is not comprehension, it's tolerance. Accountability forces them to sit with shame without an escape hatch. Control provides that escape. When Emily began responding differently, less reactive, less apologetic, more grounded, Daniel didn't consciously think, "I'm losing control." What he felt was something more primitive. Disorientation, a loss of emotional footing, a sense that the usual rules no longer applied. People often describe this moment as the narcissist panicking, and that's not far off. But it's not panic in the way we usually think of it. It's not fear of abandonment alone. It's fear of exposure. Without control, the narcissist is left alone with themselves. And that is the one place they cannot stay. This is also why calmness in a partner can provoke such intense reactions. When you are calm, you are no longer broadcasting emotional cues that the narcissist relies on. You are no longer mirroring their distress or absorbing their projections. You are no longer confirming their narrative. Your calm becomes a mirror, and they do not like what it reflects. There's another layer to this that often goes unnoticed. Narcissists don't just use control to regulate themselves, they use it to define reality. When they can shape how you feel, what you focus on, and how you interpret events, they get to decide what is true. This is why gaslighting is so common. It's not just manipulation, it's reality maintenance. If Emily doubts her own memory, Daniel doesn't have to doubt himself. If Emily questions her perception, Daniel's version becomes law. If Emily feels unstable, Daniel feels solid. Control keeps the narcissist's world coherent. When that coherence breaks, everything feels at risk: status, image, relationships, even identity. That's why losing control doesn't lead to introspection. It leads to escalation. It's also why narcissists often seem oddly energized during conflict. While you feel drained, they feel activated. Your emotional pain becomes proof that the system is still working. Your distress reassures them that they still matter, still have influence, still exist. When you stop reacting, the system starves. This is the moment many survivors misinterpret. They assume the narcissist's increased intensity means the relationship is important, or that the narcissist is fighting for it. In reality, they are fighting for regulation, for familiarity, for relief from internal discomfort. This is why pleas for empathy rarely land. Empathy would require the narcissist to momentarily step out of self-protection and into mutual recognition. That space is terrifying for someone whose entire structure is built around avoidance. So instead of empathy, they reach for control. And when control doesn't work the way it used to, they don't abandon it. They refine it, they sharpen it, they diversify their tactics. Understanding this is not about demonizing narcissists. It's about demystifying them. When you see that control is not about you, your worth, Your behavior, your mistakes, you stop personalizing the response. Emily didn't change because she wanted to hurt Daniel. She changed because she was growing. Daniel didn't react because Emily was wrong. He reacted because growth disrupted the system that kept him psychologically afloat. Once you understand that control is oxygen to a narcissist, their behavior becomes tragically predictable. Not excusable, but understandable. And understanding is power. Because when you know what they're really fighting for, you stop trying to give it back. And that's when the next phase begins. Trick number 1. They turn up the volume, escalation and intensification. When a narcissist realizes that control is no longer guaranteed, the first thing they do is not retreat. They don't pause to reflect. They don't reconsider their behavior. Instead, they do what has always worked for them in the past. They turn up the volume. Escalation is the narcissist's most instinctive response to losing control. It is automatic, almost reflexive. Whatever behaviors once kept you emotionally close, confused, compliant, or self-doubting will suddenly intensify. Louder, sharper, more frequent, more extreme. The logic is simple. If it worked before, it will work again, if I push harder. This is why the early stages of escalation can feel so disorienting. From your perspective, nothing you did should have caused such a reaction. You didn't attack. You didn't threaten. You didn't demand anything unreasonable. You simply changed your emotional posture. And yet the response feels wildly disproportionate. Daniel didn't start screaming at Emily right away. That's an important detail. Escalation doesn't always begin with rage. Often it begins with pressure, more questions, more commentary, more concern. He started bringing things up repeatedly, old issues, minor slights, conversations that had already been resolved. He framed them as problems that needed to be addressed urgently. "You've been different lately," he said more than once. "You seem distant. I don't know why you're shutting me out." To someone on the outside, these might sound like bids for connection. To Emily, they felt like interrogation. Every interaction carried a subtle demand. Return to who you were. Reassure me. Fix this. Escalation works because it overwhelms. It floods the nervous system. It creates urgency where none needs to exist. And urgency is fertile ground for control. When you feel pressured, you're more likely to abandon your boundaries just to restore calm. As Emily stayed steady, Daniel escalated again, this time emotionally. His tone shifted, his patience thinned. Small disagreements turned into character assessments. What had once been about behavior became about who she was. "You're selfish. You've changed. You're not the person I fell in love with." This is a critical turning point. Narcissistic escalation often moves from situational complaints to identity attacks. The goal is no longer to resolve an issue, it's to destabilize your sense of self. When that still didn't work, the escalation took another form. At a Thanksgiving gathering in Chicago, surrounded by family and laughter, Daniel chose his moment carefully. He didn't confront Emily directly. Instead, he laughed and said to the table, "Emily's been under a lot of stress lately. She's been really sensitive. I'm trying to be patient." The room nodded sympathetically. Someone patted his arm. Emily felt her stomach drop. This is escalation with an audience. Public escalation is especially powerful because it isolates you while making the narcissist look reasonable, even kind. They don't raise their voice. They raise doubt about you, about your stability, about your intentions, and suddenly you're not just defending yourself internally. You're questioning how others see you. Escalation also often includes intensified gaslighting. As control slips, the narcissist becomes more invested in rewriting reality. You may hear firm denials about things you know happened, delivered with absolute confidence. "That's not what I said. You're twisting things. You always remember things wrong. What makes this stage so dangerous is that the narcissist often appears calmer as you become more unsettled. They speak slowly, deliberately, as if you are the irrational one. This reversal is not accidental, it's a strategy. If you lose your composure, the escalation has worked. Another layer of escalation involves intimidation, not always overt threats, but subtle reminders of consequences. The narcissist may hint at withdrawing affection, support, resources, or even relationships. They may reference what you could lose if things continue this way. Well, if this is how you're going to be done, I don't know how long I can do this. People are starting to notice your behavior. These statements are designed to make you feel unsafe, not physically, but emotionally and socially. Safety is leverage. When you fear loss, you're more likely to comply. What's important to understand is that escalation is not proof of how much you matter to the narcissist. This is a common and painful misconception. Many survivors interpret escalation as passion, fear of abandonment, or evidence that the narcissist cares deeply. In reality, escalation is evidence of dependency on control, not on you as a person, but on you as a stabilizing force. Daniel wasn't escalating because he loved Emily more. He was escalating because the system that kept him regulated was failing. Her calm, her boundaries, her lack of reactivity created a vacuum. Escalation was his attempt to fill it. This is also why escalation often feels relentless. Narcissists can sustain conflict far longer than most people because conflict energizes them. It keeps you emotionally engaged. It keeps the focus on them. It restores a sense of influence. You, on the other hand, feel exhausted, and that exhaustion is part of the strategy. When escalation works, it trains you to think, if I just go back to how I was, this will stop. And often it does, temporarily, which reinforces the cycle. The narcissist learns that turning up the volume gets results. But when escalation doesn't work, when you don't snap, don't collapse, don't explain, don't chase, something else begins to happen. The narcissist's behavior becomes more erratic. The pressure increases, the tactics diversify. Because now they're not just trying to regain control. They're trying to avoid the unbearable feeling of being powerless in the presence of someone who is no longer playing their part. If you're in this phase, it's important to name what's happening accurately. You are not provoking chaos. You are witnessing resistance to your growth. You are not becoming difficult. You are becoming less controllable. And escalation is the narcissist's way of telling you, without words, that something fundamental has shifted. This is only the first trick. When it fails, they move on to the next. Trick number 2, they punish you for changing. When escalation doesn't work, when louder voices, sharper words, and increased pressure fail to pull you back into line, the narcissist often shifts tactics. This time, the strategy is quieter, colder, and far more insidious. Instead of trying to overpower you, they try to condition you. They punish you for changing. Punishment is not always obvious. In fact, the most effective punishments rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as distance, fatigue, disappointment, or needing space. On the surface, it can look almost reasonable. But underneath, punishment has a very specific purpose: to teach you that autonomy has a cost. Emily felt this shift almost immediately after Daniel realized that turning up the volume wasn't working. The arguments faded, but something else took their place. The warmth was gone. Conversations became transactional. Affection disappeared without explanation. He stopped asking about her day, stopped reaching for her hand, stopped initiating connection. At first, Emily wondered if this was progress. At least the fighting had stopped. But what replaced it felt worse, like standing in emotional winter waiting for warmth that never came. This is how punishment works. It doesn't attack you directly, it deprives you. For narcissists, punishment is a way of regaining control without confrontation. If they can't make you comply through pressure, they try to make independence feel unbearable. The message is never spoken outright, but it is felt deeply. If you don't return to who you were, you will lose me. And for someone who is empathetic, bonded, or trauma-attached, that threat cuts deep. Punishment often takes the form of withdrawal. The narcissist becomes busy, unavailable, distracted, suddenly overwhelmed by responsibilities they never mentioned before. Texts go unanswered, plans are postponed indefinitely, emotional presence evaporates. When Emily finally asked Daniel what was wrong, he didn't accuse her. He didn't raise his voice. He sighed. "I just don't feel close to you anymore," he said. Things have changed. There was no acknowledgement of his behavior, no curiosity about her experience. Just an implication. This is happening because of you. Punishment works because it triggers self-doubt. You start replaying your choices. You wonder if you asked for too much, if your boundaries were too rigid, if your growth came at the expense of connection. The narcissist doesn't have to say, "This is your fault." Your nervous system fills in the blanks. Another common form of punishment is the silent treatment. This isn't simple avoidance. It's a calculated absence. Communication becomes minimal, flat, or non-existent. You feel erased, yet hyper-aware. The silence forces you inward where guilt and fear do the narcissist's work for them. What makes this especially damaging is that when you try to name the behavior, it gets denied. "I'm not ignoring you. I've just been tired. You're reading too much into this." These responses do more than deflect responsibility. They gaslight your emotional reality. You're not just being punished. You're being told the punishment isn't happening. This creates a painful bind. If you protest, you're too needy. If you stay quiet, you suffer alone. Either way, the narcissist remains unaccountable. Punishment also often shows up as conditional affection. When you comply, warmth returns. When you assert yourself, it disappears. This intermittent reinforcement is neurologically powerful. It creates a cycle where your brain becomes hyper-focused on restoring connection, even at the expense of your own needs. Emily noticed this pattern clearly. On days when she softened her boundaries, when she reassured Daniel, explained herself, or avoided topics that might upset him, he was kinder, more present, almost like the man she remembered. On days when she stayed grounded and firm, the coldness returned. This wasn't coincidence. It was conditioning. Punishment teaches you what version of yourself is acceptable. There are also invisible punishments, subtle shifts that are hard to explain but impossible to ignore. Tone changes, delayed responses, a lack of enthusiasm when you speak. These micro-withdrawals accumulate, leaving you anxious and scanning for signs of approval. And then there is punishment through projection. The narcissist frames their withdrawal as a response to your supposed flaws. "You're hard to be around lately. You're always tense. I don't feel safe opening up to you." These statements reverse the roles. Suddenly, you're not the one being hurt. You're the one causing harm. This keeps the focus off their behavior and places the burden of repair squarely on you. It's important to understand that punishment is not about teaching a lesson in a healthy sense. It's about control through discomfort. The narcissist is not asking for dialogue or repair. They are waiting for you to break. And many people do, not because they are weak, but because humans are wired for connection. The pain of emotional withdrawal can feel intolerable, especially when it comes from someone you once felt close to. This is why punishment is so effective on people who are compassionate, reflective, and emotionally invested. You don't want to hurt anyone. You don't want conflict. You don't want to be the reason the relationship feels distant. So you start adjusting yourself. You soften your boundaries. You minimize your needs. You apologize for things you're not sure you did. You start shrinking, not because you believe you're wrong, but because you want the pain to stop. From the narcissist's perspective, this is success. Daniel didn't need Emily to admit fault. He just needed her to return to the version of herself that made him comfortable. The version that absorbed discomfort instead of creating it. The version that prioritized harmony over truth. But something had already changed in Emily. Even as the punishment hurt, she noticed something else. Clarity. The silence showed her how conditional the connection had been. The withdrawal revealed how quickly affection vanished when she stopped self-abandoning. What once felt like love now felt like leverage. This is the paradox of punishment. It's meant to pull you back, but it often exposes the truth. Punishment also escalates over time. If emotional withdrawal doesn't work, the narcissist may add sarcasm, passive-aggressive comments, or subtle shaming. They may mock your boundaries or frame them as selfishness. They may enlist others, saying things like, "I don't know what's going on with her lately," planting seeds of doubt while maintaining plausible deniability. And throughout all of this, the narcissist remains convinced they are the injured party. In their mind, they are reacting, not controlling. They are protecting themselves, not punishing you. This makes direct confrontation futile. If you call out the behavior, it's denied or reframed. If you ask for connection, it's withheld. If you express pain, it's minimized. The system is designed to exhaust you into compliance. The most painful part of this phase is not the punishment itself. It's the temptation to take responsibility for it. To believe that if you just explain better, soften more, or try harder, the warmth will return permanently. But punishment only stops when you submit, or when you stop playing altogether. Understanding this is crucial. You are not being punished because you are cruel or unreasonable. You are being punished because you changed the rules of engagement. You stopped managing someone else's emotional world at the expense of your own. Punishment is not a sign that you did something wrong. It's a sign that your growth disrupted a system built on your self-sacrifice. And when punishment no longer works, when you don't collapse, chase, or beg, the narcissist moves to the next tactic, one that doesn't just target your emotions but your identity. That's when they begin rewriting the story. Trick number 3. They rewrite the story, smear campaigns, and image control. When escalation fails and punishment no longer bends you back into shape, the narcissist turns to something far more calculated. This is the phase that feels the most disorienting, the most isolating, and often the most traumatic. Not because of what is said to you, but because of what is said about you. This is where they rewrite the story. Up until this point, the conflict may have felt private, confined to conversations, or to arguments, silences, and emotional distance. But now, the narcissist shifts the battlefield. Control is no longer sought only in the relationship, it's sought in the narrative surrounding it. And make no mistake, for a narcissist, narrative is everything. Daniel had already accepted something internally, even if he would never admit it out loud. Emily was no longer controllable. She wasn't chasing. She wasn't collapsing under silence. She wasn't scrambling to restore peace at any cost. And when a narcissist realizes they cannot control you directly, they try to control how others see you instead. This is not impulsive. It is strategic. Smear campaigns rarely start with blatant lies. They begin softly, wrapped in concern, a quiet comment to a friend, a sigh in a conversation, a carefully chosen sentence that frames the narcissist as patient and you as unstable. "I'm really worried about Emily. She's been under so much stress lately. I don't think she's herself anymore." Nothing overtly cruel, Nothing you can easily point to and say, that's a lie, and that's exactly why it works. By the time Emily noticed the shift, it was already happening. In her nonprofit office in Austin, conversations changed. Invitations slowed. Colleagues who used to engage warmly now spoke carefully, as if walking on eggshells. No one accused her of anything outright. They didn't have to. The story had already been planted. Smear campaigns are not about facts. They are about emotional positioning. The narcissist positions themselves as reasonable, wounded, and misunderstood. You are positioned as difficult, unstable, selfish, or cruel. This reversal accomplishes several things at once. It protects the narcissist's image, it isolates you from potential support, and it preemptively discredits anything you might say in your own defense. This is why defending yourself often backfires. When Emily tried to explain her side to one trusted co-worker, she was met with polite discomfort. "I'm sure there are two sides," they said. But the doubt lingered. The narcissist's version had already shaped the emotional frame. What makes this phase so devastating is the sense of powerlessness it creates. You are being talked about, judged, and reinterpreted in rooms you are not in. You feel stripped of agency. Your character feels under attack, and the instinct to correct the record becomes overwhelming. But here is the painful truth. Smear campaigns thrive on reaction. The more you explain, the more defensive you appear. The more emotional you become, the more you seem to confirm the narrative being spread about you. The narcissist counts on this. They know that calm confidence undermines their story, but distress feeds it. This is why narcissists often appear strangely calm during smear phases. They've externalized the conflict. The chaos is no longer inside them, it's around you. Another crucial detail many people miss is that smear campaigns are often preemptive. By the time you realize what's happening, the narcissist has already been telling their version of the story for weeks, months, sometimes even years. They've tested it, refined it, adjusted it based on audience reaction. You are late to a conversation that has already shaped opinions. This realization can be crushing. It makes you question your judgment. How long has this been happening? Who believes them? Who believes me? And perhaps most painfully, who never really knew me at all? Smear campaigns are especially effective because they target one of the deepest human fears: social rejection. Humans are wired for belonging. When that belonging is threatened, the nervous system goes into overdrive. You may feel compelled to prove your goodness, your truth, your innocence. But innocence does not dismantle a smear campaign. Disengagement does. Daniel's narrative about Emily was carefully constructed. He never called her abusive. He never used extreme language. He simply portrayed himself as exhausted and confused, and her as unpredictable. This allowed others to fill in the blanks themselves, and once people fill in those blanks, they rarely revisit them. It's important to understand that the narcissist does not experience this as cruelty. In their mind, they are restoring balance. They believe they are correcting a story that no longer serves them. The fact that it harms you is secondary or irrelevant. This is because narcissists do not see relationships as mutual. They see them as roles. And when you stop playing your role, the story must be adjusted to explain why. Smear campaigns also serve another purpose. They allow the narcissist to avoid self-reflection entirely. If everyone believes you are the problem, they never have to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. Their identity remains intact. For the person on the receiving end, this phase can feel unbearable. You may grieve not just the relationship, but the loss of community, reputation, and shared history. You may feel erased, misunderstood, or replaced by a caricature of yourself. This is where many people make the mistake of trying to clear their name. But here is what survivors eventually learn, often through painful experience. You cannot out-explain a narrative built on emotional manipulation. You cannot reason with a story designed to protect someone else's ego. And you cannot force people to see you clearly if they benefit from misunderstanding you. What you can do is stop participating. Emily didn't make a dramatic announcement. She didn't confront Daniel publicly. She didn't launch a counter-campaign. She focused on something quieter and far more powerful. Consistency. She stayed grounded. She spoke truth calmly when asked without over-explaining. She allowed people to believe what they wanted. And over time, something subtle but important happened. The people who mattered began to notice discrepancies. The story Daniel told didn't quite match Emily's behavior. The instability he described didn't align with her steadiness. The victimhood he claimed began to feel rehearsed. Truth doesn't always win quickly, but it has a way of surfacing. This is one of the hardest lessons in healing from narcissistic relationships. Not everyone will see the truth. Some people will side with the narcissist permanently. Some will never question the story they were given, and that loss is real. But those losses also reveal something important. They reveal who was connected to you and who was connected to the narrative. Smear campaigns are designed to make you feel small, powerless, and alone. But they also expose the limits of the narcissist's control. If they truly had power over you, they wouldn't need to recruit others to maintain it. Rewriting the story is a last-ditch effort to preserve an image when reality no longer cooperates. If you are in this phase, know this. You are not crazy. You are not imagining it, and you are not obligated to destroy yourself trying to correct a story that was never told in good faith. Sometimes the most radical act is letting the story fall apart on its own. Because when a narcissist has to rewrite reality to survive, reality is already winning. And when this tactic fails, when the narrative no longer brings the control they hoped for, the narcissist makes one final move. They walk away, or they try to pull you back. That's where we go next. The final move: discard, disengage, or hoover. There comes a point in the narcissistic cycle when the noise stops, not because peace has been found, but because the narcissist has reached a conclusion. Control has not been restored through escalation. Punishment has not pulled you back into compliance. The rewritten story is no longer producing the leverage they hoped for, and so they make their final move. It often arrives without warning. One day, the tension that once filled every interaction simply vanishes. Messages go unanswered, plans dissolve without explanation. Emotional connection evaporates as if it never existed. The narcissist may still be physically present, but they are emotionally gone, or they may disappear altogether. This is the discard. For Emily, it wasn't dramatic. There was no breakup speech, no closure conversation. Daniel simply withdrew. Conversations became sparse, then superficial, then non-existent. He stopped sharing his thoughts, stopped asking questions. Boda stopped reacting. It felt less like a goodbye and more like being erased while still standing in the room. This is how narcissistic discard often works. It is not a mutual ending. It is a unilateral disengagement that leaves you suspended in uncertainty, searching for meaning in silence. Discard serves a very specific purpose. When the narcissist can no longer control you, staying connected becomes uncomfortable. Your presence reflects their failure. Your boundaries remind them of limits they cannot tolerate. So instead of facing that discomfort, they detach. But detachment does not mean freedom, for them or for you. There are two primary forms of discard. The first is emotional. The narcissist remains technically there but is no longer invested. They may still communicate when necessary, but warmth is gone. Intimacy, is gone. You become a background object rather than a relational partner. The second is physical. The narcissist leaves, moves on, replaces you quickly, sometimes shockingly fast. This is the version that hurts the most. Emily struggled to understand how Daniel could seem so unaffected, how he could detach so cleanly, how someone who once demanded so much emotional closeness could now act as if she were interchangeable. This confusion is one of the deepest wounds of narcissistic relationships. It makes you question your significance. You wonder if the connection was ever real. You replay memories, searching for evidence that it mattered. But the truth is not that it didn't matter, it's that it mattered differently. Narcissists don't bond in the same way emotionally mature people do. They attach through utility, validation, and regulation. When those functions are no longer fulfilled, the attachment loosens. Not because they never cared, but because care was never the foundation. This is why discard often feels so abrupt. The internal decision was made long before the external behavior changed. And yet, discard is not always the end. Sometimes, after a period of silence, the narcissist returns. This is the Hoover. Named after the vacuum cleaner, hoovering is the attempt to pull you back into the dynamic once the narcissist senses an opportunity. That opportunity may come when you start to heal, when you move on, or when their new source of validation fails. Hoovering can take many forms. A sudden apology, a nostalgic message, a reminder of shared memories, a crisis that only you can understand. I've been thinking about everything. I miss what we had. I've changed. I need you right now. What makes hoovering so confusing is that it often feels sincere. The narcissist may sound reflective. They may express regret. They may even acknowledge harm, vaguely. But here is the critical distinction. Hoovering is not about repair. It's about access. True repair requires accountability, sustained change, and respect for boundaries. Hoovering bypasses all three. It focuses on emotion, urgency, and longing. It targets the parts of you that are still tender. Emily felt this pull intensely. After months of distance, Daniel reached out with a message that seemed softer than anything she'd heard in years. He spoke about missing her presence, about feeling lost, about wanting to talk. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Hope surged, doubt followed, then fear. Was this the ending she had been waiting for, or the beginning of the cycle all over again? This is where understanding patterns becomes life-saving. Hoovering often happens when the narcissist's external world destabilizes, a new relationship disappoints. Their image takes a hit, loneliness creeps in. They remember the stability you once provided. What they do not suddenly remember is your humanity. This is why hoovering rarely leads to lasting change. The underlying structure remains intact. The narcissist may promise differently, but promises are not transformation. Without deep, ongoing work, which most narcissists resist, the dynamic resumes quickly. Sometimes the hoover fails. You don't respond, you don't re-engage. And when that happens, the narcissist may return to discard, this time more final, more dismissive, more contemptuous. This back and forth can be exhausting. It keeps you emotionally tethered even when the relationship is technically over. You may find yourself waiting for messages, analyzing silence, bracing for reappearance. This is not weakness. It's biology. Trauma bonds form through cycles of intensity, withdrawal, and relief. The nervous system becomes conditioned to associate connection with survival. When the bond is threatened, the body protests, even if the mind knows better. The narcissist, however, experiences this phase differently. Discard restores a sense of control. It allows them to feel superior, detached, unbothered. Hoovering tests whether that control can be reclaimed. At no point is the question, how can we heal this together? The question is, do I still have access? This realization is painful, but it is also clarifying. Daniel's final withdrawal forced Emily to confront something she had been avoiding. The relationship could not be saved because it was never built for mutuality. It was built for regulation, and once she stopped providing that, the structure collapsed. This is why closure rarely comes from the narcissist. Closure would require acknowledgement of the harm, responsibility for the cycle, and empathy for your experience. Those qualities threaten the very defenses narcissism depends on. Closure instead comes from understanding. Understanding that discard is not proof of your disposability. Understanding that hoovering is not proof of love. Understanding that disengagement is not failure. It is an ending to a system that required you to disappear. The final move feels cruel because it is abrupt. But it also reveals the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. When someone can only stay connected to you as long as they can control you, the loss of control will always mean the loss of connection. And once you see that, something begins to shift. You stop waiting. You stop hoping for a version of them that never existed. You start turning your attention back to yourself, not as an afterthought, but as the center. That is where real recovery begins. But before that recovery can take hold, there is one more critical piece to understand. Because even after the narcissist's final move, many people unknowingly pull themselves back into the cycle. Not because the narcissist returns, but because old habits remain. That's why the next part matters so much. It's about what not to do when the tricks appear. Because avoiding those traps is how you finally break free. What not to do when the tricks appear. By the time the narcissist's tricks reveal themselves, escalation, punishment, smearing, disappearance, you are often exhausted. Not just emotionally, but cognitively. You've spent months, maybe years, trying to understand what went wrong, what changed, and how something that once felt so meaningful became so destabilizing. And in that exhaustion, it becomes dangerously easy to do the very things that keep the cycle alive. This part is not about judging yourself. It's about naming the reflexes that feel natural but quietly pull you back into the narcissist's orbit. One of the most common mistakes people make is trying to explain themselves into safety. When the tricks appear, there is a powerful urge to clarify, to correct misunderstandings, to finally be heard. You may feel convinced that if you could just articulate your feelings clearly enough, calmly enough, compassionately enough, the narcissist would finally understand. Emily fell into this trap more times than she could count. When Daniel escalated, she explained. When he punished her with silence, she explained. When he smeared her, she explained, to friends, to co-workers, to herself. Each explanation felt reasonable. Each one felt like an act of integrity, and each one drained her. What makes explanation so seductive is that it feels like maturity. It feels like communication. But in narcissistic dynamics, explanation often functions as self-erasure. You are offering emotional access to someone who has already shown you they will not use it responsibly. Narcissists do not lack information. They lack tolerance for accountability. Explaining yourself assumes that misunderstanding is the problem. In reality, resistance is. When someone is committed to not seeing you clearly, no amount of clarity will change that. Another common mistake is arguing for fairness. You may find yourself pointing out double standards, inconsistencies, or contradictions. You may try to reason with logic, hoping it will pierce through emotional distortion. But narcissistic systems are not built on logic. They are built on power. Every argument becomes a stage where the narcissist can redirect, deflect, or dominate. You may leave the conversation feeling depleted, confused, or ashamed, wondering how something so simple became so twisted. Emily noticed this pattern late one night after yet another circular conversation with Daniel. She had laid out her thoughts carefully. She had spoken calmly. She had avoided blame. And yet, somehow, she walked away feeling like the aggressor. That wasn't an accident. Another trap is seeking closure from the narcissist. Closure feels like a psychological necessity when a relationship ends abruptly or painfully. You want answers. You want acknowledgement. You want some version of the truth that makes the experience feel real and complete. But narcissistic closure is an illusion. Any explanation they offer will center themselves. Any apology will be vague or conditional. Any reflection will avoid responsibility. And often the conversation will reopen wounds rather than heal them. Closure does not come from the person who caused the harm. It comes from understanding the pattern well enough that you stop asking them to validate your experience. A particularly painful mistake is defending yourself against the smear campaign. This often feels unavoidable. Your reputation matters, your character matters, and when lies or distortions circulate, the instinct to correct them is human. But the danger lies in overcorrection. When you rush to prove your innocence, you may unintentionally reinforce the narrative that you are unstable, reactive, or overly concerned with appearances. The narcissist relies on this dynamic. They know that your distress will make their calm performance more convincing. This does not mean you stay silent in all circumstances. It means you choose your responses carefully, sparingly, and without emotional urgency. Truth spoken calmly over time carries more weight than frantic self-defense. Another mistake is monitoring the narcissist, checking their social media, asking mutual contacts what they're saying, reading between the lines of every silence or appearance. This behavior is understandable, but it keeps you psychologically tethered. Emily noticed how much of her mental space Daniel still occupied long after their interactions had ended. She wasn't talking to him, but she was still orienting herself around him. That awareness became a turning point. Healing does not begin when the narcissist disappears. It begins when you stop tracking them. One of the most subtle traps is self-blame disguised as self-reflection. Healthy self-examination is valuable, but in the aftermath of narcissistic dynamics, it often mutates into something else. You replay conversations. You scrutinize your tone. You wonder if you were too cold, too demanding, too emotional, too distant. You call it growth, but it feels more like self-punishment. This is especially common for people who are empathetic and conscientious. You want to learn from the experience. You want to be better. But there is a line between reflection and rumination, and narcissistic abuse trains you to cross it. Not everything that went wrong was yours to fix. Another thing not to do is rush your healing to prove strength. There can be pressure, internal or external, to move on, to appear unbothered, to demonstrate resilience. But healing is not a performance. Suppressing grief does not make you strong. It makes you numb. Emily realized this when she noticed how quickly she tried to reframe everything as a lesson, skipping over the pain entirely. She was proud of her insight, but she hadn't actually felt the loss. When the grief eventually surfaced, it hit harder than expected. Strength is not avoidance. Strength is presence. One of the most important things not to do is take your pain back to the narcissist. When you are hurting, lonely, or confused, the pull to return to what is familiar can be overwhelming. You may tell yourself you're not seeking reconciliation. You just want to be understood. But returning with vulnerability to someone who has already used it against you only deepens the wound. It reopens access to a system that thrives on your exposure. Your pain deserves witnesses who can hold it with care, not exploit it. Finally, do not underestimate the power of non-engagement. Many people fear that disengagement is passive or weak. In truth, it is one of the most active choices you can make. Non-engagement is not silence born of fear. It is silence born of clarity. It is choosing not to correct every lie, not to respond to every provocation, not to participate in conversations that erase you. It is recognizing that you do not need to attend every fight you are invited to. When Emily stopped engaging, something unexpected happened. The noise quieted, not immediately but steadily. Without her reactions, the dynamic lost momentum. What once felt consuming began to feel distant. This is the paradox of narcissistic systems. They collapse without an audience. Avoiding these traps does not mean you will never feel tempted. It means you notice the temptation and choose differently. Over and over again, sometimes clumsily, sometimes imperfectly. And each time you choose not to engage, not to explain, not to chase, not to defend, you reclaim a small piece of yourself. That reclamation is not dramatic. It is quiet, but it is cumulative. And it is how freedom begins. The final part of this journey is not about them at all. It is about you, who you become when you stop fighting a battle that was never yours to win. That is where this story truly ends. Reclaiming yourself. Power without war. There is a moment, often quiet, almost anticlimactic, when you realize the fight is over. Not because the narcissist admitted anything, not because justice arrived wrapped in clarity or apology, but because something inside you no longer needs to engage. This is not the moment you win. It's the moment you stop needing to. Emily didn't experience this as a sudden breakthrough. There was no dramatic decision, no triumphant declaration. It came gradually, in fragments. A morning when she woke up and didn't check her phone first. An afternoon when she noticed her body felt lighter in a space that used to make her tense. An evening when Daniel crossed her mind, and for the first time she didn't feel the urge to analyze, explain, or brace herself. That was the beginning of reclaiming herself. True power after narcissistic control does not come from confrontation. It does not come from exposure, revenge, or even validation. Those paths keep you oriented toward the very system you are trying to leave. Real power comes from something far less visible and far more transformative. Disengagement without bitterness. This is what power without war actually means. For a long time, Emily believed that strength looked like standing her ground in conversations that never ended, like defending her truth with perfect words, like holding steady in the face of manipulation. And while those efforts were understandable, they were also exhausting. They required her to remain present in a dynamic that thrived on her presence. What she eventually realized was this: the narcissistic system does not collapse when you prove your point. It collapses when you remove your participation. Reclaiming yourself begins when you stop measuring your healing by how little they affect you, and start measuring it by how fully you inhabit your own life. When your days are no longer shaped by anticipation or avoidance. When your nervous system no longer scans for emotional danger that isn't there anymore. This phase often feels unfamiliar. Without chaos, there is space, and space can feel unsettling when you're used to intensity. You may notice an urge to fill it, to replay old conversations, to revisit the story, to check for updates. This isn't failure, it's withdrawal from a bond that once felt like survival. But slowly that space becomes something else. It becomes room to breathe. One of the most important shifts in reclaiming yourself is redefining what strength looks like. Strength is no longer endurance, it's discernment. It's knowing when not to respond, when not to explain, when not to engage with something that demands your energy but offers nothing in return. Emily noticed how often she had equated love with effort, how she believed that if something was hard, it must be meaningful. Healing taught her a different lesson. Peace does not require persuasion. Another critical part of reclaiming yourself is letting go of the need to be understood by the narcissist, or by everyone else. There may always be people who believe Daniel's version of the story. There may be relationships that never recover. This is one of the hardest losses to grieve because it feels unjust. But clarity eventually replaces outrage. You begin to see that being misunderstood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you is not a failure of character. It's a boundary revealing itself. Reclaiming yourself also means rebuilding trust, not with others first, but with yourself. Narcissistic dynamics train you to doubt your perceptions, minimize your feelings, and override your instincts. Healing requires reversing that training gently, consistently. You start asking different questions. Not how do I make this stop, but what does my body need right now? Not was I wrong, but what felt true to me in that moment. These questions shift the focus away from control and back toward presence. There is also grief in this stage. Grief for the version of yourself who tried so hard. Grief for the future you imagined. Grief for the love that never became what you hoped it would. This grief does not mean you are going backward. It means you are allowing yourself to feel what you once had to suppress. Emily learned to let that grief move through her instead of interpreting it as a sign she should return. She stopped treating longing as instruction. She let it be information about what she valued, not about where she needed to go. Power without war also means releasing the fantasy of closure. There may never be a conversation that ties everything together neatly. There may never be acknowledgement or remorse. Waiting for those things keeps you tethered to an outcome you cannot control. Closure is not something the narcissist gives you. It's something you give yourself when you stop asking them to validate what you already know. As Emily rebuilt her life, something unexpected happened. Her sense of identity shifted. She wasn't the person who survived narcissistic control anymore. She was simply herself, someone who had learned, changed, and grown. The story became part of her history, not her definition. This is the quiet triumph of healing. You don't erase what happened, you integrate it. You carry the wisdom forward without carrying the weight. And perhaps most importantly, reclaiming yourself means learning to choose peace even when conflict is available. Narcissistic systems train you to believe that intensity equals importance. Healing teaches you that stability can be deeply meaningful. You begin to recognize red flags sooner, not with hypervigilance but with clarity. You trust yourself to walk away from dynamics that require you to disappear. You no longer negotiate your worth. Emily's life did not become perfect. Healing did not make her immune to pain or disappointment, but it made her free from the need to fight battles that could never be won. That is power. Power is waking up without dread. Power is speaking without rehearsing. Power is being alone without feeling empty. Power is connection that does not require self-abandonment. And power without war is knowing that you don't have to prove anything to anyone who only values you when they can control you. If you are at the end of this story, wondering whether it truly gets better, know this. The goal was never to defeat the narcissist. The goal was to come back to yourself. And once you do, the war ends, not because someone surrendered, but because you walked away from a battlefield that was never yours. That is where this journey completes its arc, not with noise, but with peace. Final reflection. The story beneath the story. Emily's journey was never really about Daniel. It only looked that way at first. Like many people who find themselves entangled with a narcissist, she believed the conflict lived in the relationship. in the misunderstandings, the arguments, the silences, the sudden shifts. For a long time, she thought if she could just understand what was happening, if she could respond better or explain herself more clearly, the chaos would settle. But as the story unfolded, a deeper truth emerged. What Emily was actually experiencing was not a breakdown of love, but the collapse of control. At the beginning, Daniel's control felt like intensity, closeness, and emotional gravity. As long as Emily reacted, adjusted, and questioned herself, the system functioned. When she grew calmer, clearer, and more grounded, that system began to fail. And every reaction that followed, escalation, punishment, smearing, withdrawal, was not proof that Emily was wrong, cold, or cruel. It was proof that she had changed. The most painful realization Emily faced was also the most liberating. She was never meant to fix the relationship, because the relationship was never built for mutual growth. It was built for regulation. Once she stopped providing that, the dynamic could not survive. Yet the ending of the story was not dramatic. There was no final showdown, no moment where Daniel finally understood. The real ending happened quietly inside Emily when she stopped orienting her life around someone else's emotional needs, when she no longer tried to win clarity from confusion or peace from chaos. The lesson in this story is not that narcissists are villains and survivors are heroes. The lesson is subtler and far more useful. When someone needs to control you in order to feel safe, your growth will always feel like a threat to them. When a relationship only functions as long as you abandon yourself, the cost of staying will eventually outweigh the fear of leaving. For the audience listening to this story, the application is deeply personal but universal. You may not be in Emily's exact situation, but you may recognize pieces of yourself in her. The over-explaining, the self-doubt, the exhaustion, the confusion that comes from being punished for becoming healthier. The takeaway is this: healing does not require confrontation. It requires clarity. It requires recognizing patterns without internalizing blame. It requires choosing peace even when chaos tries to pull you back. And most importantly, it requires remembering that you do not need to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Your power is not in proving your worth. It is in no longer negotiating it. When you stop fighting for space in someone else's story, you finally have room to write your own. Quick question for you. When you think about your own experience, which realization helped you more? A. Understanding the narcissist's patterns. B. Relearning how to trust yourself. Comment A or B below. And now I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated the most with your own life or relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. If this content helped you feel seen, understood, or clearer, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating honest, thoughtful content like this, and helps these conversations reach the people who need them most.